Citizen Talks is a podcast series brought to you by TRT World Citizen, featuring discussions with humanitarians and activists, artists, and changemakers, exploring the global humanitarian issues that shape our society and the world at large.
Hello, I'm Hatice Nur Keskin, and this is Citizen Talks. Today with us we have Dr. Waheed Arian. First of all, thank you for being with us and honoring us with your presence. Dr. Waheed Arian was born in 1983 and spent most of his childhood with first-hand experience in the Soviet-Afghan conflict that we mostly only read about. Having spent his life in refugee camps, he became ill several times due to severe conditions and malnutrition. The volunteer doctor who treated him inspired him to seek a similar career. Thus, when he moved to England, he worked hard to study medicine at Cambridge University and completed his clinical studies at Imperial College London. He is the founder of Teleheal, a charity that helps doctors in conflict zones reach out to other doctors, for which he received many awards. First of all, I know you have a memoir called In the Wars, where you talk about yourself and your story in detail. But for our audience, can you give us a summary about your childhood and the Afghanistan that you remember?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be your guest, to be the recipient of your award on behalf of 1 billion refugees and migrants across the globe, and also to be talking about important issues today. I was born in Afghanistan, in Kabul in 1983, during the Afghan-Soviet conflict. I have only two happy memories from the first 5 years. One was being taken to a local park by my mother for a treat of an ice cream and to have a play. And another one is when my father knelt down to give me a big kite and then for him to suddenly disappear. That's how my childhood can be summarized in times when there were losses and reunions. After 5 years, for us to be together, and my father wasn't hiding from the military service, so for us to just be living between ourselves and for my parents to be present, we moved to Pakistan as refugees. The normal borders were closed, so we had to take a very dangerous route through mountains, valleys, and rivers that took us 7 days and 7 nights. And we did that at night time to escape military attacks, although we did come under the attack 3 times, and we miraculously survived those attacks. We landed in Peshawar, Pakistan, where we stayed in a refugee camp for 2.5 years, like millions of other Afghans at the time who migrated as well. In the refugee camp, although we were safe from bombs, but the conditions were inhumane, like many other refugee camps that we see across the globe. We, as a family of 8, we started living in a mudroom, which was later upgraded to, as a family of 8, we started living in a tent, which was later upgraded to a mudroom with temperatures rising up to 45 degrees Celsius. Limited access to food and clean water. Most of us suffered from malaria. Again, something that we see in refugee camps actually across the globe. And after about 3 months, I started coughing. I was coughing to the extent that I even brought up blood, and I was very weak. I couldn't even walk. And I was diagnosed by a local doctor with having tuberculosis, which is a life-threatening disease. My experience with tuberculosis was something that inspired me to get interested in medicine. I got treated by a very kind doctor who was treating me for more than a year. Every 3 months giving me medicine on one hand, on the other hand was trying to encourage me to not give up on the fight. On my last visit, he gave me a stethoscope and a large medical textbook, and he said, "Son, one day you will become a doctor." I was very enthusiastic about what was going on. So after 2.5 years, we went back to Afghanistan. In Kabul, we stayed for a year before the civil war started, and that was a street-by-street fight, because of which we had to flee from one part of the country to another, again hiding in cellars from daily rockets, bombs, and shellings. And it's in those cellars where most of my education happened, self-education happened, through these books that my father and I would buy from the streets in Kabul, lying, would bring them, and I will self-teach myself. I didn't have any hope, but the only thing I knew was that giving up on hope was not the option. I migrated to, my parents sent me to the UK on my own as a child refugee, age 15. And I landed there in 1999 with no family support, about $100 in my pocket, and hardly any education. But
were you on your own during that time?
I was on my own.
Completely on your own, no guidance, no nothing, no caregivers?
No caregivers. Wow. And it was the time when Afghanistan was going through a civil war. The whole family couldn't come out. It was only one person, myself, who came to the UK. In a way, I was smuggled because the official routes were not available. They're still not available, by the way, actually, across the globe when we talk about conflict zones. The official routes for people who are fleeing conflict and persecution is not there, sadly. So that was my new life in the UK, starting with zero on finances in terms of the family support and not having education. But what I brought with me was that hope to find safety somewhere, and also with the dream for me to become a doctor. I didn't know how. On one hand, on the other hand, I did bring in the scars of conflict with me in the form of post-traumatic stress with me.
Mm-hmm. So that moves on to my second question, actually. How did you manage to keep your mental well-being throughout this ordeal? Would you like to share that experience with us as well?
So people across the globe who are going through adversities, many of them likely go through traumas, situations that are highly stressful, distressing for them, and that can really impact them mentally. That can cause mental health problems such as severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The WHO World Report that was released in earlier this year, and I was really honored to be one of the biggest supporters in Geneva, it emphasizes that up to 22% of the population living in conflict zones can suffer from severe mental health problems. And sadly, I was one of them. As a child, I first had depressive symptoms when I was 10 or 12. I actually couldn't make meaning, or I couldn't understand the meaning of life because it was all bombs. I was born into war and I needed to understand what was going on. And when I came to the UK, although I was safe, but the red buses on London streets would turn into tanks. In the middle of the night, I would wake up and suddenly I would see that there are snipers trying to take my head off. So I had to open a window and see for myself that actually I was not in a conflict zone there. And I was constantly hypervigilant. The way I coped with it, even despite not receiving professional help, which is actually what's needed. Yeah. So I continued to do exercise throughout my childhood, something that I brought with me when I came to the UK. On the other hand, as a Muslim, I had a strong belief in faith, and I still do, that God is looking after us, and for us not to lose up or give up on hope as well. And that's something very, very important for everybody going through adversity, is that although you can't see or you may not be able to see any light, but giving up on the idea that one day you might be able to see light is the beginning of a very dark tunnel. Yes. I didn't go through that. And thirdly, it was for me also trying to pursue my dream of becoming a doctor, to have a purpose in life. We shouldn't underestimate the power of purpose. But ideally, actually, for people who are going through mental health problems, what we need is professional help and expert-led psychological support.
This issue does not seem to be prioritized by humanitarian aid organizations. In addition to providing the basic needs and medical support to refugees, do you have any initiatives for the psychological and mental well-being of refugees?
So mental health and mental health problems are not easily visible. So sadly, I think that's a big component to it, that issues in the humanitarian world, such as access to food, water, clean water, shelter, and safety are prioritized, and rightly so. And the rationing of resources is another issue, that a lot of the resources are actually given for these basic living necessities. But mental health is part of the basic living necessity, and it's something that I emphasize quite a lot in my book, In the Wars, as well as in my advocacy, because I suffered it myself. And I know deep down that a lot of people going through conflict persecution, or people, for example, who have come out of the pandemic. They have suffered loss of some sort, whether it's a job, it's a relative, it's a spouse, or in any other way they've suffered. They need support. And that support, on one hand, is not available largely as well, in particular for migrants and refugees. Their needs are a bit different as well. They're coming in with the unique stories, with unique context, and that sort of support is something that I'm now trying to address through an initiative called Arian Wellbeing, which is to provide high-quality mental health services for everyone, regardless of their race, background, religion, and financial circumstances. On one hand, to provide those services for people who can afford it, but also to have a way for those who can't afford it, and all virtual.
So if we move on to another topic, I want to know your opinion on the global refugee crisis. What is your view on the global refugee crisis?
With the increase in the climate change and the spreading conflict, because of the conflict recently, we have actually seen an increase in the refugee numbers, sadly a stark increase. We're around 103 million forcibly displaced people now across the globe. And that's something that I think should alarm each one of us because of climate change or because of the nature of conflict that overnight that can turn everything upside down for millions of people, as we've seen it in Ukraine, in Syria, in Afghanistan, has been over decades, but in some other countries that has happened overnight. So it could be any of us. And for that reason as well, I think we really have to find ways to receive each other as human beings. Regardless of where we live, we share humanity. We share universal human values. And that is peace, that is access to education, to healthcare, to basic living necessities, and access to safety. That is what refugees, these are the main parts of their human rights that refugees seek. So they're not seeking a life that is more advanced. They're not seeking to take people's jobs when they come to another country, and they do contribute as well. So in summary, that we're going through times actually that the refugee population is on the increase. On the other hand, I have seen a lot of people who are showing compassion as well, although the inequality in how we perceive refugees vary.
There has been a lot of discrimination against refugees on a global scale and on regional scales. We saw this very clear with some of the Western remarks against Ukrainian refugees versus Syrian refugees. How do you think we can change the negative views on refugees in general?
So if you look at refugees from the perspective of the general public, I have to say that I'm absolutely encouraged wherever I go around the world that people see them as human beings. They see them not just as numbers. They don't see them as people who are coming in with different language and culture. They see them as people who need support, and people give them shelter, food. They provide them whatever support they can. I've seen it in the UK where I live. I've seen it in Pakistan where I stayed myself. And of course here in Turkey, which is one of the most generous countries, hosting more than 3.7 million, the largest number of refugees. And I've actually strolling to the shops here in Turkey, I've seen that Afghan refugees and Syrian refugees who are all working, they're contributing back. So that's more the reality from the public perspective there. But their mindset is also shaped by how the politics is played, and how the media plays a role in that as well. And that's sadly where one component is that refugees are being politicized. They're being weaponized simply because they don't have a voice. They can't stand up for themselves. They can't talk about their human rights openly. This is something that I feel passionately about. I've written a book about it, and I talk about it with you right now, is that the idea of the far right or some politicians, not all, but some politicians really use refugees for their own advantage. And this is something that we should address And I think it's hugely unethical to use them and in a way to bring fear into the population to gain votes. And certain sections of the media as well, large sections of the media, they do an amazing job. But certain sections of the media, I think they could reevaluate their approach to how refugees should be promoted across in the country, the community, and across the globe.
I think social media also plays a very important role in this discrimination as well. I mean, loads of misinformation and everything are widespread across, regarding refugees. And I think for that reason, I don't know whether you'd agree, but having an effective voice on social media is also very important to spread awareness and be the voice of the refugees.
Absolutely, I agree with along what I said about the media. It's the social media as well.
Yeah.
It can be used for the good of the world, but it can also be used against refugees. So if we have some sort of ethics around that in a way to safeguard the human rights, that would be great.
How do you think that COVID affected the humanitarian aid process?
COVID, in a way, showed us the inequalities even more so. I can give you one example, for example, in Afghanistan, where my family still lives, my 6 sisters and my father. My father caught COVID earlier this year. He only had one vaccine. I don't know of what sort. So the vaccine was delivered back there very, very late than most of the developed countries. So we can already see that many populations in developed countries, they had their second and third vaccinations, and many people in low resource countries and conflict zones didn't even have access to a single dose of vaccine. And my father was in intensive care for 3 months. He nearly died. His life was saved because of the international charity that Arian Teleheal that connects doctors from the National Health Service in the UK and across the globe to medics in Afghanistan and other low resource countries. It was that collaboration that saved him. But many people died because of that. And we also see that COVID actually showed us that the inequalities of how other aspects of inequalities affect people as well. Many people who are living in very crowded accommodations simply because they can't afford to self-isolate in a different room. People who couldn't afford to self-isolate for 7 or 10 days or 5 days, whatever the rules, regulations were, because they have to go out to find food for their families, to feed their families. So with COVID, I think we have to understand that it showed us that the physical, the mental, and the social aspects all go hand in hand together.
Definitely. So do you have any final message for us, for the youth and for the public in general as well?
I would say I have 2 messages. One is a message of hope for the youth. It's something that the youth are our future leaders. Many of them are the current leaders. They are change makers. They're bringing an amazing change, especially with the power of social media. They're doing a great job in their local communities, nationally and globally. And for them to be holding on to hope is something that I would wish them to do. So if they are pursuing a big dream that they want to bring a change, it will take a very long time. And it will take a lot of influencing of the politicians on one hand, the public, and to bring an action on the ground. So for them not to give up on that dream and to keep continuing to have that hope, to see that change despite all these challenges, is something that a lot of people with talent could actually do with. And as a result of that, for not giving up, they will be able to see that change through and to bring like-minded people together with them. And another one is actually a message of compassion, of kindness. It's for the general public and for everybody listening. And that is that regardless of our backgrounds, regardless of our race, regardless of religion, we can coexist with each other as one human being. And that's through compassion and through kindness. It's up to us whether we see the negative in each other, whether we see the differences, or we see what actually unites us. And I think hope and compassion that unites us all.
Thank you, Dr. Waheed, for giving us your valuable time, coming to us and sharing your experiences with us at TRT Citizen. We hope to see you again in other projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.